Okay, well, thank you everybody today for joining our live session on a discussion of Hamilton. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the U.S. Embassy to be hosting today's discussion. I want to thank in particular our partners and friends at CCQ, Georgetown, Qatar University, Northwestern, Studio 22, Doha Film Institute, Qatar Foundation, and Qatar Museums for promoting today's event. I'd also like to thank our friends and esteemed professors, Dr. Scott Curtis from Northwestern University, Dr. Maurice Jackson from Georgetown University, and Dr. Chris Sparshott from Northwestern University for today's participation. Allow me to read their brief bios. After that, I'd like to welcome our ambassador, our chargé d'affaires, Ambassador Holtz, to give some brief remarks, and we'll take it from there. So Dr. Scott Curtis, he is Associate Professor in Residence at Northwestern University in Qatar, where he has taught film history, theory, and analysis since 2011, after teaching at Northwestern University in Evanston for 13 years. Dr. Maurice Jackson teaches Atlantic World and African American history at Georgetown University. Before coming to academia, he was a shipyard rigger, a construction worker, and a community organizer. He's the author of Let This Voice Be Heard, Anthony Benezet, father of Atlantic abolitionism, co-editor of African Americans in the Haitian Revolution and DC Jazz, stories of jazz music in Washington, DC. He was the inaugural chair of the Washington, D.C. Commission on African American Affairs, appointed by the mayor. Dr. Jackson wrote the liner notes to the 2 jazz CDs by Charlie Hayden and Hank Jones, Steal Away, Spirituals, Folk Songs, and Hymns, and Come Sunday. He is soon to complete Halfway to Freedom, The Struggles and Strivings of Black Folk in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Christopher Sparshott is a historian studying the American Revolution. Drawn to the loser's politics, Christopher is interested in recovering the stories of ordinary men and women who became loyalists. When everybody around you is calling for revolution, why would you risk everything and support the British Empire? Christopher is convinced that finding the answers reminds us of the human quality of the revolution. History is sometimes about bad choices. He says he tries not to think about why he's so interested in those bad choices. So we're happy to have all of you. Thank you so much again for your participation today. And last but not least, allow me to introduce our chargé d'affaires, Ambassador Greta Holtz. She's a senior career US diplomat with extensive experience in the region. She assumed her duties as chargé d'affaires at the embassy on Sunday, June 14th, 2020 of this year. Ambassador Holtz previously served as senior advisor in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs in May 2019. Prior to this, she served in senior positions, including U.S. Ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman. She's also served as the Minister Counselor for Provincial Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, as well as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy and Strategic Communications in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Other assignments have included postings in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Tunisia, Syria, and Turkey. As you can tell, she's quite an expert in the region. We're so happy to have her as our chargé d'affaires. At the department, she served as the director of the Middle East Partnership Initiative, the State Department's coordinator for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and a senior watch officer in the State Department's Executive Secretariat's Operations Center. She holds a BS in Political Science from Vanderbilt University, an MA in International Relations from the University of Kentucky's Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, and an MS in National Security Studies from the National War College. She joined the Foreign Service in 1985 and studied Arabic at the Foreign Service Institute's Field School in Tunisia and Turkish at the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington, Virginia. She is also the recipient of numerous State Department awards, as well as awards from the Department of Defense. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ambassador Holtz. Over to you. Thank you.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, it said you had to unmute me. So thank you for that lovely introduction. I think I will cut back my bio because it just proves how old I am when you list all the places I've served and the jobs I've had. But really, it's quite an honor and pleasure for me to be with our distinguished panelists today. And I want to thank you for helping us do this, for agreeing to do it, and leading this important discussion at a very critical time in our country, but in the world, as issues that are addressed or talked about in the amazing musical Hamilton are playing out right now across our country and certainly in other places in the globe. So I don't pretend to have any answers, but I'm very keen to promote the dialogue, to hear the questions from our listeners, the thoughts and very thoughtful commentary of our panelists. And it's an honor to be with you guys here today. It's a big honor for me to serve in Qatar. I'm thrilled to be here. I've been on the ground, as was mentioned, 3 weeks. So not an expert by any means, but or on Hamilton, but I loved it. I must say it's an amazing vehicle for discussion. And so I will turn it over to you guys and let the real substance of this video begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Much appreciated. So before we kick off into questions that we'd like to pose to the panelists, and before we obviously come to questions posed by you in the audience, and by the way, please post your questions in the chat box of this session or on Facebook Live or Instagram where we promoted our program. We'd very much like to hear from you. As I said, before we kick off though into actual questions and answers, I'd like to actually pose a poll to all of you participating. So give us a minute and we'll give you about a minute to answer. And then based on those results, I think we'll have a really interesting discussion. So stay tuned. We'll be posting that poll just shortly. Okay, you should all be seeing that right now. So please take a minute and then we'll go ahead and tabulate that and lead the discussion. Okay, 6 more seconds. Okay, great. So we all saw the same screen. What theme from Hamilton most resonated with you? Number 1 was by a wide margin, history, followed by civil rights and music for a second place tie. And then we also had justice and abolition of slavery and women's rights. So very interesting. Thank you all for sharing that with us. All right, so now we'd like to move to the panel. The question I'd like to pose to the panel is, what are your general observations about the film? What did you enjoy most or least? So I'd like to have, please, if possible, Dr. Jackson start, followed by Dr. Curtis. And then before we launch into Dr. Sparshott's answer, we will launch one more poll. So thank you so much. Dr. Jackson, over to you.
Well, thank you, Karima, and thank the embassy, and congratulations, Ambassador Holtz, for on your appointment. It's good to know that that the affairs of the United States, especially in this region, are in such capable hands of a person who actually knows the region. I have many thoughts about the film. Of course, I was not one who had the money to go to the original place, so I'm grateful to have seen this exhibit. The first thing that strikes me, that will strike anyone, is the production itself, the music, the aura, the talent of these young African American and Latino and other peoples there. I'm a big fan of show tunes, going back to the Gershwin era and things like that, and so here represents the best. There are many things that strike me about it, and other people talk about it. But what struck me most is that this was a period when America had the opportunity to solve the problem of slavery. Slavery became the central issue. In fact, the Americans there, and Benjamin Franklin and others used the term that they were fighting against their own enslavement of the British. And so the opportunities were there. And I saw that in some responses, Mr. Miranda said that the criticisms were valid, that he did not deal with this quite enough. A few things about it was that this comes at an important time in our discussion. As you know, Juneteenth, the discussion of Juneteenth has been a big thing in the United States lately. Big discussions about the meaning of the 4th of July. And Frederick Douglass, the greatest of Americans, said that what is the 4th of July to the American Negro? What does it mean to the American Black person? As we're discussing these things now and looking at the film, it's in the midst of the debate about what represents the best of society and what represents the type of society that people in America want to live in. And therefore the debates about taking down the statues, the memory, the statues of the people who in fact enslaved African Americans, all those things come up. The two things that strike me in this, one was the fellow John Loring, and people saw that John Loring was killed. John Loring's father was named Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence was in South Carolina, a Huguenot. He was an immigrant too. People get caught up in the term immigrants. Many Americans were immigrants at the time. The greatest was, of course, Tom Paine, Common Sense. But anyway, John Lawrence's father was Henry Lawrence, the biggest slave owner in South Carolina, the biggest slave owner in America, actually. And he gave his life to end slavery. That, to me, is a key story in the debate. Of course, I mentioned somewhere along the line, I saw the name Tom Paine mentioned, just ever so slightly. But Tom Paine wrote perhaps one of the greatest documents in American history called Common Sense, which called upon the Americans themselves to first fight against the British, but secondly, to release the Africans from bondage. So there are many, many things that come to mind in this most magnificent production.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for your reflections. And I think we'll have a really great discussion after the brief introductory remarks from our colleagues. Look forward to questions from the panel as well. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. So now I'd like to hand the floor to our esteemed colleague, Dr. Curtis.
Thank you, Karima, and thanks to the Embassy for organizing this. I echo Maurice in my gratitude for having this kind of forum and this kind of discussion to talk about an amazing work that still resonates. And so, like Maurice, I hadn't seen this before this week, so seeing it for the first time on television. A big television, but nevertheless television, it was still incredibly moving. So what I took away from it was the power of the work itself. So it makes you wonder, wow, in the theater it must have been amazing, but seeing it on film too, seeing it on television, seeing it as a filmed reproduction of a play, brought out the film guy in me, right? I'm a film historian. And so I was wondering, one of the things I really enjoyed about the work was the interplay between theatrical and filmic conventions, the way that the power of the work has been translated into film, even enhanced by the subtle alternation between long shots and close-ups, for example, or certain moments in the production where use of camera technique, such as in the Satisfied number, really expresses the protagonist or the singer's emotions at that moment. So I was really struck by the quality of the production itself, right? It's an amazingly powerful play, but I thought it was really well done as a film reproduction of a play too. So I enjoyed that. So that kind of indicates where I'm coming from here as a person who thinks about art, thinks about the form of a particular artwork and how the different parts fit together. So I was really impressed with the power of the music, the way that it's a propulsive play. It takes you for a ride for over 2.5 hours and you don't stop, except for the 1 minute intermission that we had. But that kind of, driving force behind the play was really impressive, and lots of different ways in which it was working. So I enjoyed that most of all, the power of the play, the emotional power of the play. And I think that's, a good reason to think about why we should watch this now, right? Why is Disney releasing this at this moment? Certainly there are economic issues involved with that question, right? I'm sure there was going to be a theatrical release in movie theaters, but given the current circumstances, this also became a moment to, get people thinking about Disney Plus if they hadn't been already. But other than those economic considerations, we have to think about how does 2015 resonate with 2020? How does the text change over that time? Or no, not the text, it stays the same, but how does our reaction change over time? And so I think that's something we can talk about as well.
Really good point. I would urge questions from the audience on that point and others. And as you can see, we have truly phenomenal experts on our panel today who can talk about a range of issues, from film and the various facets involved in film production and the reasoning behind the choice of a musical versus a play versus straight out film. We could talk about the choice of music. We can talk about the history of the American Revolution. We can talk about the history of civil rights, including looking into the present day context. So really a lot of things we can talk about today. And I'm just very excited again to have our panelists with us today to lead that discussion. So before we kick off into Dr. Sparshott's reflections, I'd like to post one more poll at his behest for you all to please answer. Again, we'll take about a minute and then I'll share those results with you and then have Dr. Sparshott go ahead with his talk. So give us just 1 minute, please. All right, so the question is, the year 1776 and the revolution has started. Everybody's choosing sides. What side will you choose? Okay, we'll give it about 15 more seconds. Fantastic, thank you so much. So as you can see from the results, revolutionary by far was the leading choice, followed by loyalist, meaning loyalist to the British Empire, followed by, actually undecided came before loyalist. So very interesting. I think this would be also grounds for additional discussion. But with that in mind, I'll yield the floor to Dr. Sparshott. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you all very much for coming today, and let me thank the US Embassy for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity for an Englishman to talk about the American Revolution. I can't imagine what could go wrong. My role today, I think, is to contribute with the history. I'm here to talk about the American Revolution, but a word of caution first, I suppose. historians are the worst people to talk about movies with, particularly historical movies, because we tend to focus on the small little things that we don't like. My wife, in fact, has banned me from watching anything historical with her. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm approaching it as a historian. You enjoyed the film. Don't let me spoil that. I thought Hamilton was fascinating. I thought it was fascinating as a type of thought experiment. How does the revolution look different when you revolve it around one character who had his own priorities? And one of the observations that I took away from that was, where are the loyalists? You might remember the scene fairly early on where Samuel Seabury, a congregational minister, is standing up and he's briefly talking about why the revolution is going too fast, why it's getting out of control, and why you ought to be more cautious. And Hamilton very quickly dismisses him by saying, the war has begun, you're out of date, get off the stage. And that's it. Loyalists don't feature again. And that's why I thought I'd ask you the poll. You've sort of fallen into my trap, and I hoped you would. Hamilton makes it seem like independence and revolution is the obvious choice. And if it wasn't the obvious choice, then perhaps you were undecided, but you weren't going to be a loyalist. Well, that's not quite true. Contemporaries were well aware that the revolution divided the 13 colonies. It was contemporary maths, but I think it holds up fairly well when you look at the evidence, that America was divided into fifths. At either end, you had a radical fifth devoted quite keenly to their cause, whether that's revolution or maintaining the ties to Britain. But the majority of colonists fell somewhere in a spectrum in between. That the revolution was this large, confusing event that went on for decades. Talk that led to revolution started 13 years before Hamilton picks up the story and will go on for another 13 years afterwards. During that time, you had to make lots of complicated decisions. And personally, I'm fascinated in the ordinary men and women who decided that despite the fact they had no special tie to empire, and despite the fact everybody else around them was convinced that independence was the next best step, didn't join them. In fact, took what looks to us like the counterintuitive option and decided to support the status quo. Why did they do it? Well, many of them chose stability. It's not the most glamorous answer, and it's not the most intellectually ambitious answer, but people were scared of civil war. We forget the revolution from somebody else's perspective, who isn't Hamilton, looked awfully like a civil war. There are many accounts of brother fighting brother, father fighting father, families dividing. And so I approached Hamilton from that perspective. I was interested in the degree to which it told the revolution from one person's perspective and what that left out of the story, and also what that brought into the story. But from my own personal background, I was fascinated by the role loyalists played in it. And I'd obviously be happy to talk about other things that were included and weren't included. Just a short sort of temptation. Where's the Declaration of Independence? Where's the federal constitution? Where's the second president of the United States, John Adams? He's missing in action, except for a mention at the very end. So I thought it was a fascinating thought experiment. And I think that's probably enough for me from now.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sparshott. I love your witty approach to the revolution and the depiction of loyalists and revolutionaries during Hamilton. So I think certainly very thought-provoking ideas presented all around. Very much appreciate everyone's time. So without further ado, I'd like to get now into questions from the audience. The first one is from Courtney Stryker at Qatar University, our friend. Thank you, Courtney, for joining. Her question was, how does the message of Hamilton and the music choice resonate in the region? So maybe Dr. Curtis, do you want to take a stab at that, or Dr. Jackson?
Maurice is trying to say something, but he's muted.
Okay. Still muted. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, just before I go into this, just one thing, and I don't mean to contradict too much, but you know, the revolution is much more. It's quite complicated. The revolution was more than two sides. The revolution was divided into three. One half was for the revolution. One third rather, about a third were loyalists, and another third were undecided. And the other part of were all the slaves, because the slaves themselves were for the revolution. It becomes much more complicated because the British, under a man named Lord Dunsmore in November 1774, offered to free the slaves. The revolutionaries didn't offer, the British offered to free them. And he created something called the Ethiopian Regiment. So the slaves had to make a decision. So they were all these things. The slaves didn't care who freed them, they just wanted their freedom. The question of what about the region, a very interesting article came in the Washington Post this morning, a very interesting article. And it was about the concept of slavery in this region. And it was about women who had been brought over to Lebanon and other countries who were Ethiopian, who now, because of the corona crisis, their passports have been taken, they've been thrown to the wind. They cannot get home. The people who sponsored them, they lived in a form of slavery, abject slavery. They were brought here to work in people's homes. The passports were taken. They were treated like less than any human beings. So we have these conditions that exist all over the world. Slavery is not just the sense of being enchained. It's much more than that. It is the absence of the right to freedom. And so these things resonate. That's why this Black Lives Matter and the protests around Black Lives Matter has had such a tremendous influence, not just in America, but throughout the world, because of the concept that one does not have the right to control their labor. They do not have the right to control their own destiny. They do not have the right to be free of poverty, of injustice, of hunger.
Yeah, I'll agree with Maurice on that. I'll echo those thoughts precisely. And also add that the theme of revolution is more or less universal as well, because with every revolution, there's always hope. There's always a hope that ideals will be lived up to. And that's one of the main themes of Hamilton, not just in its depiction of the American Revolution per se, but in its use of people of color in the cast to depict the founding fathers. It's explicitly saying that there were ideals that were articulated within the American Revolution that America still must live up to. And that's how it resonates with 2020, but also globally, because it's always this tension between reality and the ideal. And revolution is almost always a result of that.
If I can quickly jump in, that's why I was fascinated where the documents went. The moment of possibility, if perhaps we can call the revolution, that is written down. That was the big contribution of the founding fathers. They were aware it was a historical moment. And to capture that essence, to make sure it couldn't be manipulated, it had to be written down. That was one of the great lessons you learned from the British. You didn't trust what they said. You had to see it in black and white. I think the other interesting issue that comes out of Hamilton is who gets to say a revolution's over? You find the revolutionaries, once they do get rid of the power that's in their way and set about the more difficult task of creating their own government, face the challenge of when is enough enough? And you find radicals turn into conservatives quite quickly in the aftermath of revolutions and say this far, no further. I think Hamilton addresses that issue quite nicely in the tension between himself and the more liberal Jefferson towards the end of the picture.
Thank you so much. We have a number of questions streaming in. Thanks to the audience for your interest. So I'm going to start with a shameless plug for our embassy education and English language outreach and recruitment. We received a question from Jean about undergraduate programs in the United States. So I would refer you to our embassy. We are constantly posting updates on educational programs and opportunities in the US. In addition, on our Facebook page, from time to time, we host virtual programs precisely on that topic. So I encourage everyone in this forum, if you have questions about education USA, to please tune into our social media channels. With that said, back to today's topic. So Hamad Al-Amari, our friend and the Qatari guy, he is on today's session as well. I want to thank you, Hamad, for participating. He asked a very interesting question I'd like to pose to the group, and I think there are elements here that actually could be answered by all three of you. So let me go ahead and read his question. Is history rewritten to suit a particular group of people in the world today? Are we only paying attention to one side? And are we changing it to suit the digital era? I think that's a very timely question, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. So how about Dr. Sparshott? Why don't you go ahead and start?
Certainly. There is, I think, a difference between history and memory. And what I mean by that is there is sort of history in the academic sense where you are poring over the primary sources and you have a goal of trying to get as close to the events as possible to understand them in their context, devoid of any presentist implications. But then you have the study of memory where that history is put to work. The revolution is a classic example. You could jump forward in every generation of Americans after the revolution and find a slightly different interpretation of what happened as the revolution was put to work for that generation's need. That's why it seems perhaps more so than in English history, the American Revolution is still a living moment. It hasn't been consigned to the archives because it did have so much promise, and that promise wasn't fulfilled, and then it is acted upon in bits and pieces over the next 200 years. It's very real for everybody, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting the most historically accurate interpretation of the revolution. And I don't think that necessarily matters if we recognize that we're dealing with why other people at different times found the revolution meaningful for them. So I think history and memory is a nice way to begin to split a more academic interest in exactly what happened and perhaps a more useful way of seeing how the revolution's put to work in popular culture for generations afterwards.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll piggyback on Christopher's notions there, if I may, and talk about how memory and history are refracted by various media lenses that we have access to these materials with. So every historical event we see through various lenses, ranging from diaries to historic newspaper accounts, to plays, to film, television, news programs, what have you. And each time we see something a little bit different about that historical event or the memory of that event through these different lenses. And so I think Christopher's right that we have to think about how this particular lens that we're looking at functions at this particular moment to, you know, help revivify a memory or a longing or a particular notion of a historical event. And I agree with Christopher that you can't look at some of these things for like historical accuracy. You know, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable when people ask, you know, is this film or is this play historically accurate about the events? And that is not exactly the point of this particular work. Like we've said, it's a way of understanding that particular event or keeping that memory alive for a particular purpose. It's kind of like asking, if you take the metaphor of lenses, it's kind of like asking if, you know, if a kaleidoscope does the same work as a set of binoculars, right? You know, we have both, they do different work, but you don't expect a kaleidoscope to do the same work that a set of binoculars or a microscope do. And so thinking about Hamilton in terms of history, we have to be careful and think about it in terms of the work that it does to touch upon themes, like Christopher said, that have been revisited since the revolution, and keeping those themes alive.
Fantastic.
Well, you know, that's true, but I think we have to be very, very careful in certain things. The majority of people who do look at the films and do look at this are looking at it as history, whether we like it or not. Just recently, a film in America, Gone with the Wind, which millions and millions of white people looked at, and it helped them determine their negative attitudes about Black people. It enshrined those in them. The film had to be taken out of the National Register. People looked at that. So whether we like it or not, Miranda said he spent 6 years on this thing, and he read Shannau and many others. It is nothing wrong with us expecting art to reflect history and reality. Most of the time it doesn't. But should we, but if it's built as truth, and in some ways it was. So what this should do, in my opinion, is that it should make people go deeper and think deeper about history and what were the moments and what were the moments missed. What about the people who we see as heroes? George Washington, the greatest hero, the surveyor, the self-made man per se. He like Hamilton, married well, but he had nothing. He was a surveyor. But he owned slaves, and when one ran away, he ran all the way to Boston. Her name was Ina Judd, to capture her. So you have these weaknesses within individuals. And too often we have said that it is the period of the times. We have to get rid of this. Nothing is the period of their times. No one has to be. Today we see people changing their whole attitudes about another people because they see events on TV. And this is the question of George Floyd. They see it because they visualized it. That is the moment now. People can see things because they visualize them with the telephones and everything, taking pictures. Now, last thing is, I'm a man who follows music. I'm a big jazz man. The great musicians coming out now are putting forth music that does reflect reality. It reflects the reality of a people. It reflects the reality of singing. When Beyonce is putting out some of this great music she's putting out, Lemonade and others, she's reflecting reality. Art can do it. Whether or not it does it or not is a different question.
100%. Well, thank you. Well stated, well noted. We actually have a number of questions based on that theme that I'd like to share, and maybe Dr. Jackson, you can start. So we have, and I'm going to combine some questions for the sake of time, since we have about 20 minutes. We have a question from Jim about whether slavery exists in today's world, and I'd like to couple that with Chloe's question, what Hamilton means in terms of race and American identity.
Well, the slave existing, you know, we have to be very careful in connotating 18th century slavery or slavery during time to slavery, and there are different forms. For example, in America in the 18th century, there were different forms of slavery. Some people were chattel slaves, which meant they were slaves from day one. Some people were manumitted. In New York, where Hamilton was, the notion has somehow that they weren't slaves. There were many households had slavery. They just were slaves in the house. They were not plantation slaves. Hamilton and others had the opportunity to manumit their slaves. He was a member of the New York Manumission Society. They did not manumit them. Do we have? Yes, we have slavery today, but they're in different forms. We have slavery, certainly in the Middle East. We have, you know, in America, it's not necessarily called slavery, but some people say that the prison industrial complex is a form of slavery where Black men and women are put in jail for long periods of time for crimes they did not commit, with no right, with no right to habeas corpus and no rights and others. So yes, slavery is something that exists. We see it, as I said in the big article in the New York Times today, where people in foreign countries do it all the time, take people to America. There have been cases recently in the United States, I won't mention the countries, but where they have taken domestic workers and then they've taken their passports and they've kept them in slavery for years. So yes, slavery does exist. Slavery can exist in many other forms. Slavery can exist in the form of men who oppress their wives and who don't allow them the freedom that they should have. So and so we have to look quite frankly, quite deep. And here's another question. You see, we have gotten to the notion that only during this 18th century American owned slaves. Somehow the idea that the British didn't own slaves, when they just called them body servants, or the French didn't own slaves, but they did. You must remember that when Hamilton dies, this is 1804, this is the exact year that the Haitians, who had been enslaved by the French, got their freedom. And so you have all of these concepts. So to understand slavery, we have to look deeper into its origins, but also into its history. Now, lastly, I'll say, here in Qatar, there was the link between Zanzibar and Oman and Qatar, the Indian Ocean slavery, which is now a big point of discussion, as much as the Atlantic slavery that I study. Here and at Qatar University, and at Georgetown, and others, people are looking into this links between Indian Ocean slavery and how this still has led to oppression of people even today.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. In line with that thinking and that train of thought, we have some additional questions about the casting of the film. We have Caroline, our friend Caroline Checo, asked a question about the choice of people of color in the film, why they were chosen to play typically the role of typically white, Protestant Anglo-Saxon revolutionaries. So maybe Dr. Curtis, we can have you speak to that.
Well, Lynn Miranda has said on a number of occasions that this was a look at history then from history now, right? That Hamilton was designed to confront the failures of the American Revolution, or the not complete failures, but partial failures, right? I mean, there are some good things that came out of the American Revolution, but one of the things that continues to plague American culture is its original sin of slavery and its privileging of these founding fathers as white Protestant Anglo-Saxons, as you say. So the choice was explicitly to reconfigure and have us rethink that relationship between historical figures and what they were, and the ideals that they put forth, the ideal that all men are created equal. Well, if they're all created equal, then we shouldn't be thinking about this as an unusual move, right? That the use of people of color should be just as, for white people, should be just as unremarkable as the reverse, which happened for quite a long time. So I think that's one of the reasons there. And speaking of casting, I also thought that its dual roles were very interesting too. Very often in theater, people are cast in dual roles because of budget constraints, which I don't think it was an issue with this particular production. So you have to look at thematic reasons for its dual casting. And so I want everybody to take a look at Hamilton again, or next time they do, and ask why those particular people were cast in those particular roles, in dual roles. And I think you'll come up with some very interesting thematic links between the characters.
Really good point. Thank you, Dr. Curtis. So I'd like to acknowledge some of the folks who've asked some questions that have already been answered. We had a question from Justin on historical accuracy. I think that was already answered. Jim, a question about slavery in today's world. We also had a question from Ina about the greater meaning of Hamilton in contemporary context. I think that's been addressed. Elizabeth asked about Hamilton's relationship indifference to slavery. We touched on that. Caroline, I acknowledged. And Princess asked a question somewhat related to the question Dr. Curtis just answered. Thank you. And we have a question also from Koriha that I believe was answered. So then moving on to some of the unanswered questions. Again, in the interest of time, I'll couple them. We have a question from Beatrice about any hidden meanings in the film, and one from Keller regarding the significance of the film. So perhaps Dr. Curtis, if I can call on you again, do you have any thoughts on that?
Hidden meanings. No, I don't know if there are hidden meanings. All meanings are there for us to take from any particular artwork or text as we find them, right? So the meanings are fairly manifest in this film, in this play. You know, the themes that we are already discussing about ideals, about failed ideals, about the relationship between you know, race and intersectionality, American identity. Those themes are very, 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 very present. I think there are some, I think one of the things that makes this a great work is that it will repay constant reviewing, right? So it's complex enough that all the meanings are in a variety of different ways coupling together, connecting with different themes, the various elements of the play, creating new themes, and frankly, making this a work for the ages, because I think it will resonate not just in 2015, but in 2020 and 2025, and keep going in the way that Christopher was talking about, how the American Revolution becomes a living text in a way.
Just speaking to that point, it's interesting if you look back to the last time Hamilton was on Broadway as a character, and I believe it's, Professor Curtis, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was a 1943 play called The Patriot, where Hamilton is in fact the bad guy in it, and Jefferson is the good guy because he's talking about democracy and everybody pitching in and doing their bit, which is a great wartime message, and Hamilton's more elitist stance is seen as being unnecessary during wartime. So just leapfrogging through different interpretations of Hamilton over the decades creates an interesting narrative about America at different points.
Exactly, and the way that this play rehabilitates Hamilton in the various media representations that have, you know, that we've had over the past 2 centuries. I think, as Christopher hints, the Jeffersonian interpretation of Hamilton has actually dominated media representations right up until this moment, right up until this play. So I think that's very interesting too.
You know, there's one thing that to me should come out. You know, the American Revolution, it was said that it was a fought over home rule or who should rule at home. What they meant by home rule, would the Americans free themselves from the British? Who should rule at home? What class of people? Hamilton, if you follow the film very closely, Hamilton was for a severely centralized government, everything into the power of the central authority. It was, in fact, a dangerous trend. We can see some of that in life today. Therefore, other constituencies, other groups, other meanings had no particular right. If you saw also within the film, you saw the development of this strong banking system, which was the development of modern American capitalist society, where the little man is really left out. The little man has no place in the film. And this is some of the, now, the beauty of it is that he is taking people of color and giving them these powerful positions. But it doesn't mean any less that the people who, some of those who portrayed are any less unscrupulous in this sense. Hamilton is killed near the end, but as we look at it, we also have to look at just the hundreds of thousands of slaves who were lost. That is, in some sense, the meaning is lost. The role of women, we don't see much. You see in the beginning, and you see the, the treatment of Hamilton, his wife, and things like that. But that is another element there within the whole family structure. The fact that that men become the inheritance of all, the primogeniture, and everything goes to the oldest son, all those things. So there are many meanings. And so therefore, to look at this, we have to say, why do all those things still exist and come down to today? Why is it today that we have the notion of this purely authoritarian rule? Why is it today that we have the notion that the banks shall be the arbiters of the earth? Why is it today, when we should have solved the problems of race, we should have solved the problems at the time of the revolution? We can have any answer we want to, but it could have been solved. All I had to do was listen to John Lawrence, who died. All we had to do was listen to the some of the Quakers like Anthony Benezet and others who played such great roles, but we missed the moment. That's why it's so important now, as we look at this and the questions are asked about this particular moment that we live in. No matter where you live in, no matter what part of the world, it is a moment that we may, it may take a long time for it to come back again. That's why the discussions of Hamilton are important, but then we take them beyond what they are. We reach out, we look beyond ourselves, we look to the world.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, well said. We have actually 2 more questions from the audience before time runs out. One is related to what was just discussed. So let me go ahead and share that with the group. So we have from Fatima and Hazem a question about the role of foreigners, including immigrants, in the nation's founding. And as I said, I think there's some interesting tangents between that question in today's context. So perhaps we can have Dr. Jackson or Dr. Sparshott, of course, Dr. Curtis, you're welcome as well, take on that question. I'll yield the floor to Dr. Jackson first, if you'd like to start.
Well, I think Dr. Sparshott would have something to say about this, but as I've said before, in my opinion, I mean, slaves weren't immigrants; they were captured, they were brought there. It is something different. In that sense, the greatest immigrant probably was Thomas Paine. There was no one who wanted the revolution to be an equal revolution than him. We have to understand that at the time of the revolution, it is not like people were not discussing things. In every tavern, in every church, I've read documents. I've gone to the British Museum. I've read many of the newspapers and things. It was a massive discussion all over. And they called it colonial times, as they had it in the British newspapers there. And every time a person read a newspaper, they passed it on. These days we don't, but maybe 100 people. You had people in a tavern or in a church, and they would read, or in a factory, and they would be reading the news about what happened there. And they'd be reading Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was the best, the heightened document of how to make this revolution something for all people. So you had all of those things. So the role of immigrants, and then of course you had the great Lafayette. Lafayette played a great role in the American Revolution, mobilizing. But you had other people too. You had Tadeuszki, who was a great Polish revolutionary, and he came. And in fact, when he left, the immigrants could not take money out of the country. So when he left his money to Thomas Jefferson to free his slaves, this Polish patriot. And Thomas Jefferson kept the money himself. So there are a lot of hidden histories there. And these are, as we say, the truth.
Well, this is one of those moments I warned you about earlier on where I become slightly boring. It's the sort of moment my wife doesn't like. I understand why the term immigrant is used to describe Alexander Hamilton in the production. It works well as a stand-in for outsider. But if you look at the 13 colonies clinging to the east coast of America, I'd like you to then look more broadly, span out. And suddenly you see an Atlantic British world which encompasses both the Caribbean and Canada. There are 26 colonies, not 13, in the Americas at this period. And there is constant movement between one and another. So they are immigrants to the extent they are moving from one British Crown colony to another, which doesn't quite make Alexander Hamilton an immigrant, but that's more the sort of historian talking. I think it's worth echoing Professor Jackson's point. The American Revolution is an international affair. German mercenaries fight for the British, the French and the Spanish guarantee American victory, and you find all sorts of other international characters taking important roles during it. It's perhaps only after the American Revolution does immigration become a more problematic subject for the real Alexander Hamilton and America as a whole. As America emerges as an independent nation, it faces the challenge of who gets in and who gets out. And particularly during the French Revolution, Americans faced the very difficult question, do we want to continue? Is this our fight or is it not? And under the missing president here, John Adams, he decides it's not. He passes perhaps the most draconian piece of legislation in American history, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which make it illegal to criticize the government and at a stroke cut off immigration. Hamilton at the time is a big supporter of this piece of legislation because, he sees it as essential for supporting a strong central government. That's an interesting theme that sort of fits into that larger discussion of when do revolutions end and when do you stop being experimental? For Americans, John Adams' presidency is a big moment when they grapple with that issue and immigration as a whole.
Thank you. Really thought-provoking, and I think many of us will leave today, I hope, with maybe more questions than answers, but in the sense that, these are all good thoughts that will prompt us, I think, to think about, what this means to us today and moving forward. So thank you. I have actually, let's see, 4 more questions, and we'd like to get to everyone. If everyone can stay on a few more minutes, I will try to be as succinct as possible. I will go ahead and combine 2 questions that we got from Andrew and Hazem. These are for you, Dr. Sparshott. So let me go ahead and read those. The one from Hazem, and I think you can combine these, is do you think the decision of the loyalists in the war resonates with people going through civil wars globally today? And the question from Andrew, let me pull that up for you, is what were the main philosophical arguments of the founding fathers following US independence, and what were the main arguments behind confederalism and federalism? So a bit different, but I think both speaking to your expertise.
Okay, well, if everyone's sitting comfortably, I can finish in about 2 hours, I think. If I can sort of lean to my biases and address Hazim's question first, and then perhaps gesture towards American revolutionary thinking afterwards. The short answer is yes, absolutely. Just like today, historians and politicians like to make things tidy. They like to look at incredibly complicated events and reach easy to understand conclusions that sweep aside a whole cast of actors in the process who happen to make what look like after the fact wrong choices, but which at the time were perfectly legitimate alternatives. And that's the case with any losing side in a civil war. We forget that we don't know how things end when they're happening. And reading history backwards is perhaps one of the most dangerous things you can possibly do, because it makes the result seem inevitable, and it delegitimizes the voice of so many other groups. So to the extent that loyalists represent a group whose voice has largely been forgotten and whitewashed out of the American story, yes, I think they stand in for other groups in civil wars around the world. In terms of the larger question of American politics afterwards, let me echo what Professor Jackson said, because I think that's the best way to start thinking about this. After you've worked out the question of home rule, who rules at home, and in particular, what structure do you impose to do that? the big debate of the 1780s is, did the 13 colonies join the revolution to gain their individual independence and therefore form a loose alliance afterwards that would keep Virginia, Virginia, and Massachusetts, Massachusetts? Or did they fight the revolution for a grander cause, which would require a grander union afterwards, and that would mean a stronger federal government? Hamilton, in our production, clearly is favoring the latter position, but that again is another example of the winners writing history, because the 1780s is full of lots of people that saying, nope, we don't want such a strong federal union. My identity is my state. And that state rights versus federal government is a story which very quickly takes us into the 19th century and beyond.
That didn't take 2 hours.
That's a short version. I mean, if you'd like to, I can keep going, but I think not.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, one question from Elizabeth, specifically whether we believe this film will influence the upcoming elections, and I think she means in the United States, although we could apply that to Qatar and other countries as well. So maybe I'll have Dr. Jackson take that on, if you will.
I don't know, but it could, because I think that the people, many people who are looking at Hamilton, I suspect, are looking at all of these characters, and all of these characters are black and brown, and they're Asian, and they're from different things, and this shows the beauty of what the nation actually is. So I think it can have a great influence. The discussion, you know, it's true that we don't look back, but I must take exception. I'm a historian who does not want things tidy. I wouldn't study if I wanted. What I want to do is see the conflict, the tension that always exists, and they exist today, even in discussion of this film. I'll give you one example. There's a section in the film where he talks about how Washington, D.C. Becomes the capital. And in fact, he doesn't go into it, but it becomes the capital because Hamilton and Madison made an agreement. Hamilton agreed with Madison offered to pay the Revolutionary War debts of the North. The South was rich, and he offered to pay them if the capital were put in Washington, D.C. But there was one clicker, that if we put in Washington, D.C., where George Washington wanted, because he lived right there in Mount Vernon, you would have to have slaves in the capital. So you had the capital city built on slavery. Now, all these years now, all these hundreds of years now, there's the discussion about all this in Washington, and now how to make Washington, D.C. a state where people there would actually be equal. Now that's becoming a big discussion in the election this year, whether or not Washington will be the 51st state. You see, so you're having those things. You're having the discussions around, do Black Lives Matter? And whether one agrees with this or not, one cannot look at this film without having great pride in Black and brown and other peoples, and the voice, the artistic talent. When you look at, to me, the greatest talent there, Lamar Odom, and you hear this brother sing, and you hear him sing, and you know this man can sing anything. At home, he sings, it's a Nationwide is on your side. It's like a commercial for car insurance or something like that. But he can sing jazz, and when you see the beauty, the talent of a people, then, oh yes, I think it can have a great influence, because a lot of people won't go see it. A lot of people won't go see it because they will look at it as propaganda. It's not propaganda. It's just a film that I put together beautifully. But, and it is something for people who are cultured, who want to get culture, who wants to get art. And culture need not be high culture. A man or a woman out playing a cowbell is as culture as anyone else. And so that's what we must all look at to understand the beauty of that, and also look at history below. We have to look at the links becoming up from the bottom. So I think, yes, it can have a great influence, as I suppose that some people probably would not look at it in my country. And I won't mention who they are, but some won't.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. And just as I think the film has provoked a lot of thoughts, I think today's discussion from all three of you has really done a great job in prompting us to think about why this matters. And I hope many of you will come and participate in future programs with our professor friends and other colleagues and friends that we will be putting on in the next few weeks. I will maybe close with Hamad's question, and I will take some liberty here and pose it as a rhetorical question, because I don't think there's one answer, and I think it would be interesting to sort of leave people on this note. And the question specifically was whether we're judging people of the past with the moral constructs of today, and whether we should. With that, I'd like to close and allow anybody from the panelists, the chargé or otherwise, to give closing remarks. And just want to thank everybody again for their time and participation today.
Just one thing about this. It's a good question, but you have to look at it just a lot deeper. And if you just answer it like that, then you will never solve any problems. The fact is that the issues, especially around slavery and slavery rights, was the topic of the day. And it was being discussed. It was discussed at the revolution. They put it aside. They decided not to discuss it because they knew to discuss it, to take up the Quaker proposal and to actually free the slaves would make America different. It would not make it. And had they discussed it, perhaps we would not have had the Civil War there. So no, I always disagree when people say we're looking through other lenses. You look through the lens that you have, you look through the lens of what could have been, you study history. That is why you look at that. Otherwise you just stay stagnant. And what's the purpose of staying stagnant? What's the purpose of life if you're just gonna have the same answer always? So you have to look at it from different angles.
Point taken. Anybody else?
I think I would just finish then with saying what I tell all my students: history is about context. That if you want to understand the motives of the individuals at the time, you need to understand the world they inhabited. If you want to understand why people go back to that history and reuse it, you need to understand the context in which those are being used. And so if you're trying to understand people at the time, you judge them by their own standards. If you're trying to understand how that history is reused, you need to ask whether they are appropriate role models for that particular moment in history. Do their standards align with yours? So the answer is always context, and we're back to that distinction between history and memory.
Thank you. Dr. Curtis?
Well, I'll sidestep the difficult moral question and just ask a broader question about this production. It moved you, I'm sure it did. If it did, then you have to ask what next? And you have to say to yourself, all right, this is a production that did move me. Why did it move me? Why do I feel this sense of movement, of basically doing something, of activism, right? And that is precisely the goal of this production, is to get people moved and then move them to do something, right? So it might be that you're moved in one direction, and you might be that you're moved in a completely opposite direction. But that's what artwork is supposed to do, is to move us to do something, to go beyond the moment in the theater and take that affect, that emotion, and put it to use in the world around us. So that's how I would leave with that.
Thank you, Dr. Curtis. Ambassador Holtz, would you like to say any closing remarks? We have you on mute. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank everybody, our three amazing professors, very thoughtful answers. You gave us more to think about. I want to thank you for hosting, and our PD team for pulling this together. Great questions from the audience. And yes, lots to think about. So these are complicated issues. And really thank you for taking the time to do this event with us today. And let's do more. Let's have more discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.